I was young, I was stupid. Nobody notices anything that I did after I came out of jail. I started working, I started volunteering. Honestly, if they gave me another chance, I changed.
He left Edmonton 2 years ago on a Saturday in November, forced out of the country in a deportation to a place he had never lived. Saeed Jama's story takes us into a gray zone where Canada, acting on what it says are issues of public safety, goes through elaborate efforts to send deportees to a country that would never take them officially, effectively sneaking them in with no travel documents.
People smuggling. The government of Canada is smuggling people into a foreign country.
Today, in a special documentary report, John Shipman investigates Canada's curious practices in deportations to the chaos and violence of Somalia. He follows the story to no man's land in just a moment. Also today, his was the voice that brought Canadians the stories and sounds of the Second World War.
This is Matthew Halton of the CBC. The German war is over. No more Canadians will die.
Matthew Halton was the most celebrated Canadian journalist of his era, warning of the Nazis' plans in the Toronto Star years before the Holocaust, and recording the sounds of battle for CBC Radio, a talented, tireless war correspondent who wore a uniform to cover battles and took part in bond drives for the government. In an hour, Matthew's son, former CBC correspondent David Halton, on his father's great talents, personal flaws, and lessons for a new generation still covering war. I'm Anna Maria Tremonti. This is The Current. Today we're revisiting a story we first brought you 2 years ago. Saeed Jama was a permanent resident in Canada, but he faced deportation to Somalia following a 27-month prison sentence for drug trafficking and resisting arrest. Somalia is one of the most dangerous places on the planet. The al-Qaeda-linked group Al-Shabaab fights a bloody insurgency in the south. Warlords and clans fight the insurgents, and the country has struggled without a fully functioning government for more than 2 decades. Although Jama's parents were Somali, Jama himself had never been to Somalia and understood little of the language. This is some of what he told us back in 2012 from prison while awaiting deportation.
I don't want to go to Mogadishu. I wanted to go to a different city, but they're saying, I have to go through Mogadishu. I have no plan. I got to go there and get used to it, right? Just the same way when I came here as a kid and I had to learn the language and everything.
At that time, we asked, should Canada be deporting even convicted criminals like Sayid Jama into such dangerous, lawless country? Today, we're looking at a different question. How does Canada deport a person into such a dangerous, lawless country? CBC radio documentary producer John Shipman has spent the past year investigating what exactly happened in Sayid Jama's case, and what he discovered was that his deportation was far from routine. It involved a kidnapping, a ransom, and a gun-toting gang. But even more troubling is that his chaotic deportation was not unique. We're devoting the next hour to what John learned about how Canada deports people to Somalia. Here is John Shipman's documentary, To No Man's Land.
Hello?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
This is Sayid Jama. The 25-year-old spent almost half his life in Canada. Today, he lives in Borame, a bustling city in Somaliland. Okay, so is Jamal recording right now?
He's recording right now.
We taped a phone interview with the help of a Somali journalist.
My life in Somalia right now I go to school. I go to a university.
Borame is a fledgling university town, home to Alo University, where Jama studies IT. The city sits nestled along the Ethiopian border, hemmed in by mountains on 3 sides. Jama showed the Somali journalist around his new hometown.
This is the hotel where I live in. I've been living in a hotel since I got to Borame.
Borame is a pretty place, flush with trees and greenery. The red roofs that adorn many of the city's low-lying buildings glisten in the sun.
Do you see that tall building over there? That's my university. I've been going there since October.
But Jama didn't come to Alo University for the education. He came for the student ID.
Basically, what I wanted to do here is get some kind of identification with my name on it. and the school I went into, they give IDs. After I got my IDs, my next move was to get some kind of degree or diploma.
The reason Jama is so fixated on ID is because he doesn't have any. No passport, no birth certificate, nothing. When Canada deported him, it did it without any paperwork. Legally, it's as if he doesn't exist.
So that's what I'm trying to do right now.
Still, Jama said life in Boromay is good.
The city where I am right now is actually pretty peaceful. Here I never hear gunshots.
But Boromay is not where Jama began his new life in Somalia 2 years ago. The Canada Border Services Agency, CBSA, deported him to Mogadishu, Somalia's darkened heart, 1,200 kilometers to the south.
At least 65 people are dead and 50 people are injured after a truck bomb explodes in Mogadishu on Tuesday.
Russians when an improvised explosive device was thrown at their vehicle.
At least 12 people were killed in the Somali capital Mogadishu after a suicide bomb attack. An Islamist militant.
70 people were killed yesterday in the capital of Mogadishu.
Everything about Somalia, you hear it on the news when you're in Canada. The bombings, gunfire, everybody just shooting. I was just scared the first time.
Mogadishu has been the epicenter of Somalia's civil war for more than 2 decades.
Somalia is a failed state. It's an extraordinarily chaotic, violent, and dangerous place.
That's Audrey Macklin.
I'm a professor of law and hold the chair in human rights law at the University of Toronto.
And Professor Macklin argues that Somalia is just too dangerous a place for Canada to be deporting anyone.
It is so dangerous a country that Canada not only advises Canadians not to go there, but prohibits its own officials from entering the country.
And that ban also applies to officials from CBSA, the very people tasked with overseeing deportations.
You're absolutely correct. For safety reasons, the officers don't travel into that area, so they're not actually on the plane accompanying the individual to Somalia.
That's Reg Williams. He's a former CBSA director. CBSA itself would confirm very little about the logistics of deportations to Somalia, citing privacy and security concerns as well as protecting operational integrity. However, Mr. Williams spoke freely about the process. He left the agency under a cloud 2.5 years ago for his role in a botched deportation, unrelated to Somalia. Since then, he's been critical of CBSA's leadership and record on deportations. Williams wasn't involved in Jama's case, but he did manage as many as 80 deportations to Somalia during his career. So if CBSA officials are not allowed to fly into Somalia, how do they complete deportations into the country?
Somalia is probably the most challenging logistically for removing somebody. What Canada has found the easiest and most straightforward approach is to use Nairobi as a launching point and use a private charter and charter a jet and drop them off. I mean, usually it's Mogadishu, and from there they find passage by land to their final destination.
Nairobi is the capital of Kenya, which borders Somalia to the south. So according to Williams and internal documents I obtained, CBSA officers fly with the deportee to Nairobi and then hand the individual over to a pilot or airline official who flies the deportee into Somalia.
Commercial airlines, there's a regular carrier. It used to be African Express. It may still be the same company, but I can only speak to the time I was there. The fee is usually $25,000 US, and usually paid by officers upon boarding in Nairobi, and they're paid cash.
$25,000 cash.
$25,000 US cash.
How do the officers travel with that much cash?
In their pouches, fanny packs. It's not obviously the most secure and the most ideal situation, but that is pretty much how it works. In one situation, I recall, we had to get $25,000 cash to give to the officer to take on their flight, and I had to, taking money out of the ATM machine by the airport, and I did, I think, 40 or 50 transactions. They kept resetting my limit, so I can take $500 out at a time in plastic bags in U.S. money to give to the officers. Officers, obviously, they have to exercise extra care when they're carrying that kind of cash around, but thankfully, no known cases of money going missing or being stolen or lost or whatnot.
African Express Airways did not respond to requests for comment. There are other scenarios. Sometimes CBSA uses a Canadian-based charter. Sky Service Aviation has been CBSA's go-to Canadian charter for overseas deportations for more than a decade, including to Somalia. According to public records, CBSA has paid the company almost $2 million over the past 6 years to transport non-public servants overseas. Individual contracts, which Williams said would be for a single flight, ran as much as $220,000. Sky Service refused to comment, citing confidentiality, safety, and security reasons. And there's another layer of complication.
99.9% of our clients do not have any valid travel documents from Somalia. When they came here, they arrived with no travel documents, driver's license, voter registration, birth certificates, things like that are few and far between, non-existent for all intents and purposes. So you're looking at a situation where you have a person with zero corroborating documentation.
That's not unique to Somalia. Many refugee hopefuls arrive in Canada with false or no documentation. But in almost every other case, the Canadian government negotiates with the government of the deportee's home country for a new travel document to get the person home.
The accepting country will need some chance to establish that the person, in fact, is a citizen of that country.
But as Williams explained, Canada doesn't do that with Somalia.
The former citizens of Somalia are in kind of a limbo situation. There's no central authority to validate or confirm their nationality, identity. There's no authority to issue those documents.
And there is one other challenge. How does CBSA confirm the deportation was successful?
We would request the individual to contact the officer in Nairobi to confirm that they've arrived at their final destination, or to contact a relative in Canada who in turn will confirm to officers in Nairobi that the person's arrived safely.
What can you do if you don't get that phone call?
If you don't get the phone call, there's nothing we can do. I hope everything went well. There's absolutely nothing we can do.
In other words, the Canadian government deports people to Somalia, a country it won't let its own employees enter because it's too dangerous, and it does so without any involvement of the Somali government. Instead, the agency hires an airline to take the deportee with no travel documents across international borders into a country that has not officially accepted them, and then, as Williams described it, just hopes for the best. Audrey Macklin, the U of T prof, was blunt in her assessment. She called it
people smuggling. The government of Canada is smuggling people into a foreign country. Now just imagine for a moment how Canada would react if a foreign government was smuggling people into Canada.
Williams was more pragmatic. He says CBSA was tasked with figuring out a way to get people into Somalia. This is the method it came up with. And he stressed that given the safety risks and the logistical challenges, the agency is very selective about who it deports to Somalia.
Removals to Somalia and that region are restricted to individuals with serious criminality. Your regular garden variety failed refugee claimant is not high on the list of CBSA's priorities for removal. I can't remember the last female that was removed to Somalia. Kids have not been removed to Somalia. We're looking at serious criminals who've come to the attention of CBSA because of their criminality, because of the fact they're in jail, the fact that they pose a potential risk to the community if and when they're released from detention.
In 2013, CBSA deported more than 15,000 people to countries around the world. 15 were sent to Somalia. So these deportations are not a common occurrence, and they're reserved for convicted criminals, like Sayid Jama. He came to Canada in 2001 as a 12-year-old. It was Jama's older brother Abakar who first started getting in trouble. Jama was his impressionable younger brother. Here's his older sister Layla Jama, who's a Canadian citizen now, living in Alberta.
Abakar and Saeed were the only ones that fell into the lifestyle.
Authorities say both brothers joined the African Mafia street gang in Winnipeg.
Abakar was the first one. When we came here to Canada, he was truly lost. We went to the same high school, and he was just trying to fit in, and he fell into the wrong hands. Saeed just followed in his brother's footsteps. So he was very young, he didn't know what he was doing, he saw what his brother was doing, and he just followed what he thought was right.
Sayid Jama was in and out of jail and deported to Somalia himself in 2009, and Jama followed along. He was arrested and convicted several times before he turned 18. Assault, uttering threats, possession of stolen property, and then there were the adult convictions.
There was recent arrest and a few breaches because I was on probation at the time. And there was the possession for the purpose of trafficking.
Jama was sentenced a total of 27 months and ordered deported. He didn't show up for his first flight out of Canada. That no-show landed him on CBSA's most wanted list. 3 months later, he was picked up during a routine traffic stop.
Saeed, there's going to be people that are listening to this that aren't going to have a lot of sympathy for you. You were a convicted drug trafficker. You didn't have citizenship in Canada, and you were deported. What would you say to those people?
What I did in the past, I did. But that was before I was young. I was stupid. People make mistakes, and I changed. Nobody notices anything that I did after I came out of jail. I started working. I started volunteering. I changed, and they just don't realize it.
What do you think that Canada should have done with you, and what would you have liked to have happened?
Me, honestly, if they gave me another chance.
But there would be no more chances. Within a month, Sayid Jama was on a plane bound for East Africa. He left Edmonton on Saturday, November 24, 2012, en route to Nairobi, catching connecting flights in Calgary and Amsterdam. 4 CBSA officers traveled with him, 2 men and 2 women. Jama's hands and legs were chained to a restraint he wore around his waist. The group sat in the back of the plane away from the other passengers. The officers wore vests and badges that clearly identified them as CBSA officials, until, Jama said, they landed.
Right when I got to Kenya, when all the passengers left the plane, the CBSA officers, they put their badges away, started wearing civilian clothes, and they took all the handcuffs and leg bracelets off me, and we went outside. In the morning time, there was this Kenyan dude, and he spoke Somali.
He worked for the airline African Express, which would be flying him into Mogadishu.
He was wearing worker vest, you know, the orange worker vest, and they told me he was going to be on the plane with me. I went on the plane.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to African Express Airways and
He wasn't given a boarding pass. It was a small aircraft with about 20 to 30 seats. It was nearly full.
When I was almost at Mogadishu, I looked around and he wasn't there. That's when I got paranoid. And I asked the passenger beside me to give me the phone.
Here's his sister, Sayid Jama.
Saeed was very scared. He didn't have his notebook where he had the phone number of the person that he was supposed to contact once he landed in Mogadishu.
His parents had arranged for an old friend living in Mogadishu to meet him at the airport and get him out of the city.
He called my mother here in Edmonton, and he told her that he wants the phone number of the person that he's supposed to contact.
His mother gave him the phone number, but Saeed never got the chance to call. The plane landed, and the other passengers started filing out.
I didn't know what to do.
He didn't want to leave the plane.
I was scared because if the police saw me, they would arrest me or put me in jail because I came in there with no papers. I looked around. I was the last one inside. Then this guy came in. He told me, "Oh, put on this clothes."
The man handed Jama a pair of black pants and a white dress shirt, the same clothes he was wearing. He looked like he worked for African Express. And when Jama put the clothes on, he looked like he worked for the airline as well. And then it hit him, what was happening. They were going to smuggle him out of the airport.
I walked off the plane. There was several police officers. I walked down the steps.
And right past them.
I went around where they were putting the luggages, this car there where they were putting all the luggage in.
There were 2 trucks on the tarmac, one for the luggage and another likely for food. It was that truck that Jama was led to.
I went inside that big truck, then we left from there.
The truck drove away from the airport terminal. It headed for an exit to the airport grounds. Jama told me he could see a white car parked just outside.
3 Somalis got out as the truck pulled to a stop. One of them had a gun.
Big machine gun. Big machine gun, the ones you carry with 2 hands.
Jama was forced into the back of the car. The 3 Somalis climbed back in. The one with the machine gun sat down beside him. He didn't know what was going on.
At that time, I didn't know that much Somali, so I didn't understand most of the things they were saying. I was scared.
The car pulled away from the airport and headed into the heart of Mogadishu.
We are going to take a short break for the news, and after that we will tell you how Sayid Jama's dramatic deportation to Mogadishu ended, and we'll hear of another startling deportation from Canada. Mohamed Bare Boulay never even made it into Somalia. Instead, he says he and another deportee were dumped in the Kenyan bush and left to fend for themselves. They were doing all right until a pack of hyenas caught their scent.
The hyenas started coming around us. They were about 15 or 16 hyenas. We just took 2 sticks from the bush and we were fighting against them. But my friend, he scared and he ran and he started running. And they ran after him.
That's coming up, part 2 of To No Man's Land from John Shipman. I'm Anna Maria Tremonti. You're listening to The Current. Hello, I'm Anna Maria Tremonti, and you're listening to The Current. Still to come, the Second World War was a tough time to learn the new craft of broadcast journalism. We'll hear about the lasting imprint of one of the early stars. David Halton joins me to talk about his father, Matthew Halton's life and groundbreaking work. But first, alone and afraid in one of the most unhinged societies on earth. Today we've been investigating how Canada deports people to Somalia. In our last half hour, we heard from a former director with the CBSA, the Canada Border Services Agency, who told us that Somalia is so dangerous, federal regulations prohibit Canadian employees from flying there with deportees. The agency's solution has been to hire pilots or airlines to fly deportees without legal paperwork into Somalia from a neighboring country such as Kenya. Official travel documents are impossible to come by given the country's unstable government, but such deportations can and do go off the rails. Before the break, we began the story of what happened to Sayid Jama after he was deported from Edmonton to Somalia in November of 2012. Upon landing in Mogadishu, he says he was disguised as an airline worker, smuggled out of the airport, and from there handed over to an armed Somali gang. Here's part 2 of John Shipman's documentary, To No Man's Land.
Sayid Jama was terrified. He was sitting in the back of a car heading into Mogadishu. Jama had no idea what the Somali men were going to do with him.
There was 2 guys at the front. There was a guy beside me with a machine gun or AK. They took me to a hotel. I was scared.
It was his first time in Mogadishu. In fact, it was his first time in Somalia. Sayid Jama had never stepped foot in the country before his deportation. It is another one of Somalia's anomalies. The conflict has been going on for so long that many Somalis have never been to the country. Jama was born in Saudi Arabia, where his parents worked after fleeing the civil war. But migrant workers have no citizenship rights in Saudi Arabia, and neither do their children. So when it came time to deport Jama, Canada sent him to the only place it could, Somalia, even though he'd never been there before. Jama's parents had asked an old friend living in Mogadishu to pick up their son at the airport and get him out of the city. His father Ibrahim gave the friend, a shopkeeper named Yosef Ahmed, the flight details, and Ahmed drove out to the airport to pick him up.
I was standing there and waiting. Everybody came out. And then I called Ibrahim after 1 hour, and I told him, your son is not this airplane.
Ahmed went back to his shop, but a few hours later, Jama's father called back. He said his son was in Mogadishu.
He gave me a local number in Mogadishu, and I called the number.
A man answered. He told Ahmed that they had Jama. The man instructed him to meet them downtown, just off Mogadishu's main road.
So they told me some hotel there behind, there is a house, you come there.
Ahmed understood now why he hadn't seen Jama at the airport. He'd been kidnapped, but he wasn't surprised.
Mogadishu, there are a lot of problems, so no government for 23 years. So if there is a hell on earth, Mogadishu is a hell. So many organizations working here. Terrorists, Al-Shabaab, we have everything.
Including kidnappers. Ahmed went to the meeting place. The man said they had safely transported Jama out of the airport without him being arrested. They would release him, he said, but only after they were paid for their expenses.
I asked them what kind of expenses. Then they said, okay, if you are not ready, you will not get him. And you will not even come back this house. Next time, if you come back, you will not be here. I said, no, don't do that. Then I bargained with them.
They asked for $3,000. Ahmed bargained the group down to $2,000. Then he called Jama's father, Ibrahim, with the news. He told him if he wanted his son to survive, he would have to pay.
What they do is just, if you don't pay, they will kill.
Ahmed said gangs don't even like to pay the costs of holding hostages. After a few days, they'd rather kill the person than continue to feed him.
They don't spend the money giving him food. They don't even know his language. They can't understand each other. It's easy for them just to kill him and just, even they don't bury, they just throw there. It's normal Mogadishu.
Meanwhile, Jama had no idea what was going on. He couldn't understand his captors. Had he been kidnapped? Jama wasn't sure. Could he leave? He didn't know and wasn't about to find out.
I was at the hotel and I gave them my family's phone numbers. I let them talk to my family. I don't know what was going on between them and my family. So I just went with the flow and just waited for something to happen.
A few hours later, Jama's father called Ahmed back. He'd borrowed the money from his brother in Virginia. They would wire him the ransom to give to Jama's captors.
When I went back there, Mr. Saeed, young boy, was not there. So I called them and they came and I gave them the money. After 2 hours, they delivered to me.
Sayid Jama was free.
And then he was talking about his luggage.
Jama was upset that he'd never received his luggage. Ahmed told him not to worry about his luggage.
I said, you are lucky if you have your life.
Ahmed put Jama on a truck bound for Puntland in Somalia's north, where his Darod tribe is based. Ahmed was still shocked that Canada sent the young man to Somalia.
It's better to stay in jail for the rest of the life of the boy. Bringing him here is just like a death penalty because he will lose his life. It's very dangerous.
There is no way to corroborate Sayid Jama's story beyond the family friend Yosef Ahmed. But over the course of almost a year, Jama told me his story multiple times. The details were always consistent. CBSA itself has little to say about Jama's deportation. A senior media spokesperson said the agency is not authorized to conduct a formal monitoring program after the deportation is completed, and there's no evidence the agency had any knowledge of the subsequent kidnapping and ransom. For his part, Reg Williams thought Jama's story was plausible.
Yes, it could happen, particularly if this individual had no strong ties in Mogadishu, like family ties. If the airport is controlled by a certain clan and the person doesn't belong to the clan, then there'd have to be some negotiation to how this person will get out of Mogadishu airport. In this case, sounds like he avoided one hostile clan only to land into the hands of another, equally hostile, or maybe more hostile. And that's not a good situation.
But the strongest evidence that Sayid Jama's story is credible is that it's not all that unique. I've investigated several deportations to Somalia, and the stories are all troubling. Take the case of Mohammed Jama, a violent felon who was deported from Winnipeg in 2010. In September of that year, the agency managed to get him onto a commercial flight into Bosaso along Somalia's north coast. Mohammed Jama said upon landing, armed militants surrounded the plane in an attempt to take him hostage. He claimed they shot and injured a Somali security guard. He even managed to call a CBC reporter from the plane. Here he is talking to CBC's Marianne Cloak in Winnipeg.
It's crazy here. I hope I survive. That's all I'm just saying. I'm just hoping that I survive.
According to internal CBSA documents, the agency's own sources confirmed that armed gunmen had surrounded the plane carrying Mohammed Jama. However, CBSA was told they were security officers, and the documents make no mention of shots being fired. Mohammed Jama stayed on the plane overnight and flew back to Mogadishu the following day. Or there's the case of Abdullahi Farah, another convicted criminal who was deported in June 2009. CBSA had also tried and failed to deport him a year earlier because the airline it was working with was unable to get landing rights in northern Somalia with him on board. CBSA flew Farah back to Canada at considerable expense, and on its second deportation attempt a year later, CBSA ran into similar problems. Farah languished in a detention cell at the airport in Nairobi while CBSA officials tried again to arrange landing rights for him. Days turned into weeks. A source close to the case says that Kenyan officials began pressuring Canadian officials to either complete the deportation or send him back to Canada again. Rather than bring him back, CBSA officers flew Farah to the Kenyan border town of Mandera. According to internal CBSA documents, officers gave Farah $200 US, then Kenyan immigration officials walked him across the border into southern Somalia and left him there. And then there is the deportation of Mohammed Barre Boulay.
Mohammed is a first name, Barre, B-A-R-R-E, is a second name, and third name is Boulay, B-U-L-L-E.
And how old are you?
I'm 50 years old.
And where did you grow up?
I grew up in Mogadishu.
Today, Boulay lives in an enormous refugee camp in northern Kenya run by the UNHCR, the UN's refugee agency.
It is very hard here, the life. I have a very small hall where I teach children literature and mathematics, some English. They each pay me 100 Kenyan shilling.
Worth about $1.25 Canadian.
Also, I get some very small food from UNHCR.
However, for 8 years in the 1990s, Boulay lived in Canada, where he was granted refugee status. But it wasn't long before he got in trouble with the law in Canada. He ran up 10 convictions in less than 4 years: assault with a weapon, uttering threats, drug possession. In 1997, he was deemed a danger to the public. A year later, Mohammed Barre Boulay was deported. He said his plane, however, never made it to Somalia.
My deportation happened on August 17, 1998. We flew from Vancouver to Holland, from Holland to Nairobi.
From there, he says he was put on a plane with another deportee from Holland.
We both boarded that small airplane and they handcuffed us on the seat. Canadian officials, they stayed in Nairobi, but there was another 2 plainclothes persons. They were from Kenya, and the pilot. We were 5 of us on the airplane.
Boulay said he thought they were being flown into Mogadishu or perhaps Berbera, another city in the north. And then suddenly, the plans changed.
After 1 hour in the air, the pilot said, "We are going to land in the border between Somalia and Kenya, so that you don't have to worry about going to Somalia, because Somalia is very dangerous and we cannot take you there."
Boulay didn't know what to make of the sudden change. He waited anxiously as the plane neared a dusty runway.
It was a very small airstrip right near the highway. It is just an empty field. No buildings, no person, no signs, nothing. It was a desert, semi-desert. Ground is mostly flat with no trees. Temperature was about 35 degrees, very hot.
The pilot unloaded their luggage and told the 2 deportees to follow the road. The border was not far, he promised, and there was a village nearby. And then, Boulay said, the pilot climbed back into the plane and flew off.
The two deportees watched as the tiny plane disappeared into the horizon. They had no food.
The only thing we had was a water, liter and half and liter half. That's all we had, me and my friend. It was about 2 o'clock and we start walking around 5:30 at 6 o'clock. We couldn't see nothing around there, no city, no person. The pilot was lying to us. 3 hours of running around and we couldn't see nothing there.
The evening turned into night. They were spent, hungry and exhausted with almost no water left. Boulay started worrying about the other deportee.
His name was Hanet. I don't remember his last name. He was a scary man. He was a little bit psycho. All the time he was shaking and moving his hands. And he never talked that much. I thought he was somehow high.
And things got only worse as darkness fell. Boulay can't remember who heard them first. The feet pattering in the darkness. The braying shrieks and howls. A pack of hyenas was tracking them. It was 1 a.m.
The hyena started coming around us. They were about 15 or 16 hyenas, and they were starting to scare us.
Spotted hyenas scavenge and hunt across the open expanses of northern Kenya. Like wingless vultures, they have a nose for the weak and vulnerable.
I told my friend not to run and not to scare. We just took 2 sticks from the bush. We were fighting against them, but my friend, he couldn't stay with me anymore. He scared and he started running. And they ran after him. We didn't have no lights there. And within 20 minutes, I find out he was lying on the ground. He lost a lot of blood and he was bleeding from the neck and the leg and the chest. He passed away. I digged it a little bit and I buried them there. I just left him there.
Boulay walked on, following the road through the morning of that second day, through the afternoon. Dusk was just beginning to paint the sky when he could walk no more.
There was a tree and I fell under the tree. I couldn't move from there. Around 5 o'clock in the morning, there were cow herders coming that way, and one of the cow herders, he found me with his torch.
There were 3 of them, 2 men and a woman with 2 donkeys and 80 head of cattle walking across the parched landscape.
And they give me water and some food and some milk. I told them all the situation, that I left a friend of mine died in the street. They put me on a donkey which they have, and we just kept walking from there. I stayed with them 12 days. After 12 days, we came to their village. They took me to a small town, and there was a Kenyan police officer there, and he put me in a pickup, and I was taken to Elwak.
Elwak straddles the border, half in Kenya, half in Somalia. Boulay says he was held in the police station on the Kenyan side for several days, then driven across the border and handed over to Somali authorities.
There was a Islamist fighting against Ethiopians that time.
Boulay said the Islamists fighting Ethiopia were from a group called Al-Ittihad al-Islamiyya. Funded by Osama bin Laden, it would be later added to the U.S. list of terrorist organizations in the wake of 9/11.
When I went to the Elwak, Somalia, those Islamists, they told me that I was a spy. They tried to scare me. They questioned me, but they never tortured me. They were always asking me if I know someone in Somalia. And I was saying to them, I don't know nobody. I left Somalia in 1985, and this is 1998, and I don't know nobody there.
It's unclear exactly how long Boulay was held by the group. It may have been for as long as 3 months until
the war between the Islamists and Ethiopia was finished, and they told me that I'm innocent now, and they put me in a truck to Mogadishu.
He'd finally made it to Mogadishu, but it was nothing like he remembered.
That was the worst time I had. When I went to Mogadishu, I went straight to my village where I used to live. It was deserted. Every house was broken. Nobody was living there. I cried a lot.
Like Sayid Jama, it's near impossible to independently corroborate Boulay's story. But there are packs of spotted hyenas in northern Kenya that will attack humans. And there are nomadic cattle herders that travel across the region, including in and out of Elwak. And the Islamist group that Boulay says held him after he crossed the border, it was active in Somalia throughout the 90s. The balance the Canadian government is trying to strike with these kinds of deportations is weighing the potential risk to the deportee versus the potential risk to the Canadian public in allowing the individual to stay. And it is a real risk. As Reg Williams, the former CBSA director, stressed, deportees to Somalia are criminals with multiple convictions to their name, often involving violent crimes.
To say that you cannot and should not remove cases where a person's legally exhausted all avenues of redress within the Canadian system, and there's been some determination that they pose a risk to Canadian society, it leaves Canada with very little choice. You can't win by having that person within the community and potentially compromising safety and security. It's a dilemma.
While the cases of Jama and Boulay illustrate the potential dangers to the deportees, a murder in Alberta possibly illustrates the other side of this equation. 21-year-old Jenna Cartwright disappeared from her home in Red Deer in March 2011. 2 months later, her partially clothed body was found in a ditch 60 kilometers south of the city. Ms. Cartwright left behind a young daughter, now 5 years old. The man charged with her murder was a Somali national awaiting deportation. Bashir Gashan is scheduled to go to trial next year for first-degree murder. Audrey Macklin, the human rights professor from the University of Toronto, says Ms. Cartwright's murder is a tragedy, but she points out that Canada has a criminal justice system. It works for Canadian citizens and non-citizens alike, and it's a system that we've placed certain limits on.
We don't use the death penalty anymore. That's one way of understanding why you can't deport somebody to a place where their life is going to be in danger. Just as we can't kill them, so too can we not hand them over to a place where the chances of them being killed are pretty high. Is this a perfect answer? No. But we have a criminal justice system, and we can use it.
Sayid Jama wishes Canada had given him a second chance, but Mohamed Bare Boulay says he has accepted his fate.
Really, I'm not complaining anybody. They deported me legally, but when someone is a criminal, he will be put in prison, but not thrown in the desert. That's not fair.
But Boulay says he doesn't blame Canada for what happened.
I think that the Canadian officers, I think they didn't know about that. If that Canadian officer, he knew that they were going to take me to the desert, he will never allow that. I know that. But they were very naive to make that deal with that airplane dealer. That's the mistake. The dealer, he was a liar and he was a criminal, but not the Canadians.
Still, even 16 years later, Boulay can't believe what happened to him.
I thought I was going to Mogadishu or Berbera. I never thought I was going in the middle of the desert. From Vancouver to no man's land. That's what happened to me. From Vancouver to no man's land.
have been listening to John Shipman's documentary, To No Man's Land. We requested an interview with Public Safety Minister Stephen Blaney, who is responsible for the agency that oversees deportations. He declined our request. A CBSA spokesperson responded to a list of submitted questions, and we are still waiting for a response to our request for an interview later this week with CBSA President Luc Portelance. Last week, Mohamed Bare Boulay moved out of the refugee camp in northern Kenya, where he has been living for the past several years. He is moving back to a Somali village close to the border. To see photos of Sayid Jama and for more information on what John Shipman discovered on Canadian deportations to Somalia, go to our website, cbc.ca/thecurrent.